may have heard of switches, and a lot of like home-based type switches or small business switches are unmanaged switches, which basically means you don't have any way to configure them, manage them, do anything with them. Luckily, Cisco's switches are managed switches, at least the enterprise grade ones. And that means we have the ability to do some configurations and secure the switch in a variety of different ways. And this next section we're going to look at is the basic setup of a switch so that we can manage it. So securing the switch CLI. So we're going to talk about putting passwords on, enabling SSH, making it so that not just anybody can get to it without authenticating, and even when they do get to it, that it's secured communications. We'll look at enabling remote access via IP, and then some other settings that are useful. It says in the lab, but they also can be useful in the real world. Things like not having it try to resolve names to IP addresses by default, because that can get annoying if you mistype something. You then have to wait for it to time out. So the first thing that we can do, and this is basic security, we can enable passwords on the console, on the VTY ports, and we can put an enable password on. So this will secure it at least a little bit so that not just anybody could get in, especially like plug in a console cable, get in and manage your device, or SSH in or Telnet in and manage your device. And certainly just getting into user mode is one thing, but also then into global configuration mode through enable mode is another one that we want to protect. So right now your switches in the lab aren't protected. They don't have a console password, they don't have a VTY password, they don't have an enable password. So we'd want to set those up. So in this case, they're showing you the result. If I have a switch that has a console password, I plug into the console, it's going to ask me for a password. I type in the password, that gets me to user mode. If I want to get to enable and there's a password, it's going to prompt me for the password. I'm going to have to put in the password before I get to enable mode. Same thing would happen on the VTY ports if I put a password on there. So how do I enable those? Well, it's pretty straightforward. On the switch, I go into enable mode, and then I go into global config mode. So my prompt will be switch #. I will then run the command line console 0. That puts me into the config line mode. And then I would type login, password, faith, or whatever my password was going to be. If I want to put a password on the VTY ports for SSH and Telnet, then I would do line VTY 0 to 15, that's all of them. Login, password, hope, or whatever your password is. And if I want an enable password, I type enable secret and the secret password. What's the difference between password and secret? Anyone have any idea? Yeah. Secret is encrypted. So when I put this command in, this is unencrypted, but if I were to do a show run, when I looked at this command, it would say enable secret, and then this would be an encrypted password. I wouldn't see love, I would see whatever the encrypted password is. Versus these in the config, I would see the actual password. Assuming password security hasn't been turned. If I turn on password security, these would also be encrypted. So here is that basic configuration for passwords in a switch. Now, this is the basic level of securing for authentication and access, which we should be doing, at least the basics. Now, we also have the ability to centralize our authentication and allow multiple users access. Now, note that previously we put in this login on our console and on our VTY. That basically says use the password that's here in this configuration. We're now taking this thing and saying login local, and we're using a local user database. So some username or username with the username, secret, and the password. There's actually more to this user mode command or the user command that we'll take a look at in just a sec. But then we're taking the login on the console and the login on the VTY, and we're saying login local, which tells it to use the local database of users to allow authentication into the switch. So we've enhanced it a little more because we're setting up users. So we have now some accountability. So if Wendell logs in and does something, Wendell will be accountable. Chris logs in and does something, Chris will be accountable. So here it is. So Wendell logs in via Telnet or SSH, or going one step further, we have the ability to use an external server, and that could be an external Radius server, AAA authentication server, or that could be a TACAX server, TACAX Plus server. And then those users would have to exist in that server, that Radius server. So the user attempts to log in, the switch goes and checks with that remote TACAX server or Radius server, approval comes back, the user then gets authenticated. Now, remember I said we shouldn't be using Telnet, and Telnet should be disabled. You want to use SSH. Well, SSH requires keys. So in order to do that, a couple of things have to happen. One, you have to have a host name and domain name set. So to do that, you log in, go into global config mode, type in host name, give it a host name, type in IP domain-name, give it a domain name. Then you have to generate the crypto keys. So it's crypto key generate RSA. This will generate RSA keys that will be used for securing communications for SSH. Nope, they created local usernames again, and they set the login to local. The other thing that they do here is they could disable Telnet and enable just SSH, which they're not going to. But you could do that here by setting the protocol. And then when people log in, you can see. So show IP SSH shows you that SSH is enabled. And if you look at yours right now, SSH will not be enabled. I'll just come over to the switch if it will let me in. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I guess it won't. Not helpful. My session must have timed out. I'll reset it after. So basically, you can see the SSH status, show IP SSH, and you can also see if users are connected by doing a show SSH. And that will show you that the session is in fact here, in and out, encrypted with the encryption mechanisms as well as the HMAC. And it shows you the session started and who's logged in. Much greater accountability, and the communication's encrypted. So if I want to SSH to the device, I have to have an IP address on the device to SSH to. So therefore, in order to do that, I would actually use the SVI, the switch virtual interface, on VLAN 1 by default to do this. Or if I happen to set up the management port and I have out-of-band management, I would use the out-of-band management port to do that. The idea of an SVI is I have the ability to segment this physical switch into virtual switches. So in this case now I have VLAN 1, which has a bunch of ports, and I have VLAN 2, which also has a bunch of ports. Now, which one of those am I going to use for management? It's typically going to be VLAN 1, not VLAN 2. Just because that's the default VLAN on the switch. When you get a switch, it has VLAN 1. It does not have VLAN 2. You'd have to manually create VLAN 2. Now, that doesn't mean I have to use VLAN 1 for management. Maybe I have a separate management VLAN, in which case I would set up the management VLAN and then assign the IP address on the management VLAN for those purposes. Why would I want to keep the management VLAN separate from other VLANs? Say the data VLAN where all the computers are plugged in. Have any ideas? One very, very important idea. No one has any thoughts why we would want to keep the management VLANs separate from our data VLANs? No? Security is the biggest reason. I don't want somebody to be able to sniff traffic on their data VLAN and find the traffic that's destined for management. Yep, Chris got it. Traffic security. We want to secure that. And we also want to be able to control who has access to the management VLAN. And one of the ways we can do that is by having access control lists, which are layer 2 IP based, that say, okay, only certain people have access to the management VLAN from other VLANs. And we'll talk about ACLs and access control a little bit later. Now, if I am using a separate VLAN and I want to be able to manage this across the network, then I'm going to need a default gateway, right? So even if I'm doing this, if I want to get from VLAN 1 to VLAN 2, can I do that inside the switch? Chris says yes, and I won't disagree. What has to be true about the switch in order for that to occur?
Mom said are you almost done?
No, 5:30.
He said 5:30.
Or what else has to exist in order for that to occur? So let's say that VLAN 1 is everything's a 1.x, say 192.168.1, and everything in VLAN 2 is a 2.x IP address, 192.168.2 dot something. If one of these guys wants to communicate with one of these guys, what do they have to have? Anyone know? Can I do it via layer 2? No, we need layer 3, right? We have to go up to layer 3. So can a switch that's just a switch, layer 2 switch, would these two VLANs be able to communicate? And the answer is no. If something comes in on VLAN 1 looking for a MAC address, it's going to be limited to VLAN 1. If something comes in on VLAN 2 looking for a MAC address, it's going to be limited to VLAN 2. The whole purpose of the virtual LAN is to segment that traffic as if it were two separate devices, and there is no connectivity between. However, if we did have a layer 3 switch, that actually allows the switch to act as a router for the purpose of communicating between the VLAN segments. So VLAN 1 would have a default gateway, an IP address on the interface. VLAN 2 would have an IP address on the interface, and the routing would be set up between them, so the switch would have a routing table. Or the other option is we have an external router that has both VLAN 1 and VLAN 2 in it that is routing between the two. So therefore, if we want to get from VLAN 1 to VLAN 2, we would need a route or a default gateway in order for that communication to occur. So the switch itself, if we want to manage it from somewhere else, would need to have a default gateway in order to communicate out to any other VLANs or any other LANs in general. So here is an example of setting this up. So we have a config T. Nope, we're already in enable mode. Go into global config mode, interface, VLAN 1, brings us into the config IF, so we know we're in an interface. And we set the IP address. Note, we also have the subnet mask on the end of it here, the 255.255.255.0. And we've also told it no shut. What does the no shutdown command do? Or no shut? And is it necessary? Yeah, it turns the port on, right? And if the port was shut down, so by default, the ports on a switch, the physical ports on a switch are not shut down. Unlike a router, by default, most of the ports are shut down. But VLANs may be shut down, so therefore we just do a no shut to make sure that that port is up. And note, the port then comes up, change state to up, line protocol change to up, and then we exit out, and we're setting a default gateway, IP default gateway on the switch of 192.168.1.1. So if something comes in, wants to communicate with the switch knows how to get back out. Now I can allow DHCP on my switch, and my switch will get an IP address via DHCP. So to do that, same concept, config T, go into the interface VLAN 1, and do IP address DHCP, and then no shut, and the interface will come up, and it will get an IP address from DHCP. What is DHCP? Yep, Chris, it is definitely a pool of IP addresses that are available for this particular subnet. And DHCP server would assign it an IP address so I don't have to manually configure it. Yep. Dynamic host control protocol. So if I set it up to DHCP, then I can look at show DHCP lease, and it's going to show me the IP address and subnet mask that are assigned, in this case VLAN 1, 192.168.1.101. The server itself is 192.168.1.1. And my default gateway is 192.168.1.1. No, I didn't have to assign a default gateway when I use DHCP. It gets it from the DHCP server. And then if I was to do a show interface VLAN 1, I'll see that it's up and I will see its IP address as well. And if I do a show IP default gateway, I will also see that it does have a default gateway. What is the advantage of using DHCP for assigning your addresses? Or what are the advantages of DHCP? Don't have to set static addresses. Yep, that's one very big advantage. I don't have to set static addresses on everything. So no manual assignment. What else do I get from DHCP that I don't get if I manually assign? Thoughts? I get a table of all the devices that have IP addresses on my network that are dynamically assigned at least. Because I can go to my DHCP server and it will show me a list of all the devices that are assigned with their IP address and their MAC address and their name likely. Now I do have the ability on my switch or router to do a show history, and it's going to show me all of the commands currently held in the history buffer. So I could use the up arrow and down arrow, but I also can do a show history, and it will show me everything that's in the history. And if I have some idea of what I ran for a command, but I don't remember exactly, I can do a show history, and a pipe includes or begins or whatever, and start typing part of it and hit enter, and it will find only the things that include that. I also have the ability to control the size of that buffer from the terminal, and history size overall is going to set the buffer for console and VTY. So here's an example of setting that. And also, they're using this other command here, this no IP domain lookup. So remember I told you if you type in something, you mistype it, it's going to try to resolve that to a name, to an IP address. If you put this in, it will not. And that saves time because if you mistype something, it could look for it even though it's not there, and it takes a bit of time for that to happen. Another thing that they've done here is they've done logging synchronous. If you don't do this and something pops up on the console, then it's going to interfere with whatever you're typing. If you turn on logging synchronous, it'll let that stuff scroll, but it'll put your command that you're typing at the bottom still completed, which is kind of nice as well. And then they set the history size to 20 in this case. So it'll keep 20 commands. And it says for the lab, it's nice to have these, and it's nice to have these regardless of you're in the lab or not, but obviously more helpful in the lab because you're doing a lot more configuration stuff. Okay, any questions on that? Let me reload my lab real quick. So that's going to bring us to lab and break. So the next labs, that you can do are Discovery 2. Here. Which is observing switch operations, Discovery 3. And if you want to do Fast Lab 1, you can do that as well. And we'll take another 10-minute break and then 30 minutes for lab. So that's 40. So let's shoot for the top of the hour. So it's about 3:17 now. We'll shoot for about 4 o'clock to come back. I'll be here if you have questions, and we'll go from